Yes, distinguished guests and audience, we are delighted to welcome you on the VGU Seminar Series on global finance and economics. With the knowledge we wish to share to us, we hope that we'll gain a better understanding of some pressing global economic and financial challenges facing our world today. In the very first episodes of this exciting series, very pleased to provide you an up-to-date assessment of the problem, global rising inflation, implication for policy makers. And pleasure to present to our experts who will share the insights of the research on the topic with you today. The first expert I would like to introduce today, Professor Michael Pinder, economics at the University of Frankfurt. And the second expert I would like to share with you is Dr. Lê Văn Hà, academic curator of global finance and economics at the University. And now, let's not wait longer. So I would like to give the signal and welcome Dr. Lê Văn Hà, Dr. Michael Pinder to the presenters today. Yes, Dr. Ha.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Good. Let me start sharing my screen. Thank you. Okay, so good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As introduced, my name is Ha, and I am the academic coordinator of the master program of global finance and economics, and also the bachelor of business administration. So it is my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Professor Binder, as you can see in my screen. Professor Binder is a professor of economics at Goethe University, Frankfurt. He has held the chair for international macroeconomics and macroeconometrics since 2003. He is also the founding dean of the Graduate School of Economics, Finance, and Management, and he is a member of the executive board of the Institute for Monetary and Financial Stability. In terms of education, Professor Binder got his undergraduate degree in economics, business administration, and law at the University of Kiel in Germany. He later obtained his PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania in 1995. In terms of research achievements, Professor Binder has published on a variety of topics in macroeconomics and econometrics. He was the recipient of the Outstanding Author Contribution Award at the Liberty Network Awards for Excellence in 2013. Professor Binder is an associate editor of the Journal of Applied Econometrics. This is a prestigious journal that is well known to people in the field. He is also the associate of another very good journal, editor of another very good journal, the Journal of Economics, Dynamics and Control, and the associate editor of the journal Empirical Economics. Professor Binder has also directed a part of the European Commission FP7 Research Network on macroeconomic modeling, and he is also the principal investigator of a research project on macroeconomics granted by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to the Hoover Institute at Stanford University and to the Goethe Frankfurt University. In terms of working experience, Professor Binder joined the Frankfurt University in 2003. Prior to that, he was a member of the faculty of at the University of Maryland. So he has also held appointments at other staff universities, including the University of Cambridge, the University of Munich, the University of Southern California, Samian University, Bank of Spain, the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Professor Binder was used to be a Fulbright scholar, a Marie Curie Research Fellow, a scholar of the German Academic Scholarship Foundation, and he has been the recipient of numerous teaching and advising awards. So his current research in part examines the implications of financial market structures for business cycle dynamics, output growth, and macroeconomic policy design. His research also involves the development of new econometric methods for panel data research. In terms of supporting for VGU, Professor Binder has always been a source of strong and reliable support for the Vietnamese-German University. He actively participates in the flying faculty and teach in our bachelor programs in finance and accounting and in business administration. So our audience today, some of you already know Professor Binder years before when you took his course BMAC, right? And during his teaching visits to Vietnam to VGU, Professor Binder spent his valuable time on studying the situation of the Vietnamese economy, as well as the Vietnamese government's development policy and visions. The result of this process is in the introduction of the new Master of Global of Science in Global Finance and Economics, or abbreviated as the GFE program, a milestone in our development of VGU. The GFE program prepares students for probing national and international challenges in today's financial markets and economic analysis. And it is expected to provide high quality graduates to support our country's development strategies in the years to come. So Professor Binder, thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to learning from you about one of the most discussed macroeconomic issues today. That is the problem of rising inflation. And the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I saw my life while you were talking, all those various stages, quite some years that you talked about, and so it became a very long introduction. Thank you very much for that. So let me get started and open my presentation. I will first talk about global rising inflation indeed, and then in the later parts of the program also talk a bit about the application process for the Master of Science in Global Finance and Economics. Now, before I get started on substance, let me try to make sure that there's no wrong expectations as to what I will talk about today. And hopefully, if you entered the event with maybe somewhat different expectations, adjust them before I get started. So the way I think of today's talk is that given that it is a recruitment event for the Master of Science in Global Finance Economics, that I'd like to take today one example, I would say a leading example, in that it is coming from one of the core areas of our new master program, macroeconomics and monetary economics, and talk in that context about one of the topical issues that currently is at the heightened concern of those who work in economic analysis, analysts in the financial sector, and certainly also policymakers. And in that context, specifically show how the master program can help make a difference in your understanding what is currently going on there. And in particular, not just follow the public discussion on these issues, but eventually come up with your own independent assessment of the issues involved in this context, of course, global rising inflation through your own economic and financial modeling. That is what today's event will not be, is to give you, specific forecasts of inflation and implied forecast for stock market returns or interest rates over the next 6 to 12 months or the like, and try to that way enrich what you already do know, but rather give you an idea how in the program we're gonna look at very topical issues of heightened relevance for society at large, and then through different types of modeling, try to understand what's going on, as well as give possibly advice to policymakers specifically in the sense of what would be the likely implications of different approaches to policy making, whether it may be on the monetary policy side, the fiscal policy side, or more broad in the program yet on issues of financial regulation, setting the environment within which financial markets operate. And so that's what we're going to illustrate today with one topic to keep things focused and to make sure that we are not sitting here after midnight. Still one specific topic today, the issue of global rising inflation. In terms of starting with the facts, on this slide you see what I think is a quite nice visual illustration of the current situation around the world in terms of rather unprecedented rates of inflation when we compare current ones to those in the recent and even more distant past. So what you see in this map that comes from a publication by the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C., one of the major international organizations that's concerned with macroeconomic surveillance, policy advising, as well as assistance for countries that are facing macroeconomic crisis, is a map that shows in different color codes the current, as of April of this year, projections for the year 2022 for the rate of inflation, that is the growth of prices, specifically the average consumer prices in terms of the annual percentage change. That's the change from 2021 to 2022. You do see that the US economy, if I start there, is projected to have a rate of inflation in the range of 6 to 10%. That if you look at Vietnam, you see projections that are more in the range of 3 to 6%. If you look at Western Europe, also projections in the range of 3 to 6%. Now, why are we concerned about that? Of course, from this graph per se, right, we do not see that inflation rates are rising. So on the next slide, we are putting all of that in a bit of a historical perspective. If I start with a graph here on the left, you see inflation rates here again measured as annualized rates of inflation, but reported quarter after quarter since 2017. In the light blue color, in the light blue color, you see the curve for the emerging market and the developing economies. In the darker blue color, the one for the advanced economies. For the advanced economies overall, we are at a bit above 6% in terms of the current rate. That, if you compared it to the historical past, is the highest rate of inflation in the advanced economies since about 1990. Probably before all of you were born. Inflation hasn't been that high since that point in time. So that goes back into the past history. What happened in 1990? Well, 1990, 1991, we had on the one hand the US intervening in the Middle East following the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, and we had at the same time the collapsing of the Berlin Wall, causing a huge uprise in demand in Western Europe, and of course the intervention of the US following that Iraq invasion of Kuwait, very much related to oil price issues, that there was a shortage of oil supply at that point in time. So since those two hallmark events, the highest rate of inflation. In the emerging markets, we stand at even a bit above 10%. And that results in these overall projections again for the year 2022, 8.7 for the emerging markets, slow moderation going into 2023, down to 6.5%. And for the advanced economies, the overall average projection weighted by GDP across countries is close to 6% for the advanced economies 2022 and 2.5% for 2023. One last aspect here about the figures, you also see nicely in the right-hand side of this figure, what part of this rise in inflation was specifically caused by the Soviet invasion of Ukraine, and what that has added to global inflation. You see that that is for 2022 and 2022 in the advanced economies, as well as the emerging market developed economies, a quite sizable portion of somewhere between a quarter and close to a third. Well, the prediction for 2023, of course, is very much conditional on what's going to unfold in that war, something that we probably all do not know, and the economists certainly don't have any special insight. And so, to my understanding, those projections are based on the idea that the war would come to an end by the end of the year. But who knows? And of course, that also indicates that if that war was to continue yet longer, then we may see quite sizable upward revisions again of the projections for 2023. Now, why do we care about that? Why should we care whether inflation is at the 4% or 6% or 8% or even 10%? Why does it matter? I'm sure all of you, long before today's talk, will have appreciated, well, it matters to us because inflation measures that growth of consumer prices. And so if the rate of inflation was, say, at 10% rather than at 4%, there's a sizably higher growth in the cost of goods that we'd like to purchase. That is, our cost of living go up much more strongly. And of course, that depending on the income situation of the individual household, may be a nuisance if it's a household that's very well off, may be annoyed about this higher price growth, but per se, that household not having to adjust its lifestyle. But of course, we are also having to be very clear that for a sizable group of households, also in the advanced economies and even more so in the emerging market developing economies, that means that they cannot maintain their standard of living, and that they may face significant issues in terms of purchasing food, in terms of in those countries in the world, at least where you have to heating their apartments when it comes to fall, winter again. And so very serious issues in terms of how to finance their life. Now, here we are in macroeconomics. And so I'll talk more about the macroeconomic perspective, however, and you'll see in this talk that such rising inflation is a major issue from a macroeconomic perspective as well. And it's not just an issue as to how it may heterogeneously affect different households in the economy, but is an issue that affects the macroeconomy at large too. To understand this, we'll go in a few steps. And on the first step, we'll think a little bit about, okay, where is this rise in inflation coming from? From the previous graph, right, we saw already a good bit that the most recently, certainly a sizable contribution comes from the war in Ukraine. But this rise in inflation has been going on for a longer period of time, dating back into 2020. And so it's important to understand where this comes from, because we will see the macroeconomic response should be very different depending on what is the source of this rise in inflation. And so what I'd like to show you in this context, without going into specific details of methodology, is recent empirical work that was done at the World Bank by 3 macroeconomists there, who basically use an econometric modeling approach to look at inflation together with output growth as well as oil prices across a sample of 85 advanced and emerging market economies. So basically, they collect the data going to the historical path for these 85 countries for those 3 variables, the rate of inflation, output growth, and oil prices, and then set up a quite intriguing econometric model that asked, what are the sources specifically of inflation? What was the idea? They said, well, basically what we'd like to do is we'd like to figure out, beyond oil price shocks, those of course relatively easy to measure in this context, right? Because they are one of the variables in the model, those oil prices. They said, well, other sources of shocks are not directly observable. Right? What fraction, for example, of shocks to inflation come from the supply side, come, for example, from bottlenecks in terms of global transportation, may come from shutdowns of factories due to the COVID-19 pandemic. That, at the macroeconomic level, is not directly observable. Right? Of course, you could say, well, I could go about trying to measure for each and every economy, what was the degree of restrictions on firms in the COVID-19 pandemic imposed by lockdowns, try to measure, to what extent were shipments delayed or didn't occur at all. But of course, that would be extremely challenging for such a large group of countries, right, to go back to such micro levels and try to figure out what were supply restrictions. And so the approach in this work rather is to say, well, there's some unobservable factors to us, denoted here as FT, that we try to measure through an econometric framework, even though we don't directly have data on it. And so the idea of this study is that specifically when we try to distinguish what fraction of these causes of rise in inflation come from the demand side, what come from the supply side, these are so-called unobservable common factors. Irrespective of whether you have already done any econometrics in past studies or not, right, this seems truly intriguing. How can we possibly estimate the parameters of a model where some of the model elements are unobservable? I'll not today go into the specifics of what econometrics does do. The broad idea is that we, in a way, simulate these unobserved factors such that they best match the data on the observables in inflation, output growth, and oil prices. This is surely a quite challenging estimation problem, but it's been looked at in the literature in different contexts. And so if we have, an hour or so to talk about it, I'm sure we'd all understand the core ideas going on. Now, today we don't have that 1 hour. I'd have to postpone such discussion to the course of the program that's going to deal with such dynamic factor models. That's going to be a course on macroeconometrics. And so, of course, here I'll jump right away now next to the results. But hopefully, this is the first instance where I've created some appetite for you to say, I'd really like to figure out how that's going on. Because if I figure out how that can be done, to extract from a model containing both observables and unobservables time series of unobservables that are of interest to me, like, what is in the aggregate, the total of demand shocks, what's in the aggregate, the total of supply shocks, then I could do a lot of other interesting things too, where I'd have some unobservables and like to learn from observables about the underlying unobservables. Right? To just give a different example, I could, for example, say if I have the data on actual inflation rates, maybe I could use such a setup also to measure inflation expectations, right? Rather than engaging in surveys of people, directly use observables to extract an unobserved time series. Just another example, and I'm sure we could think all of many more. All right, so that's the framework that's used in this World Bank study. Let's jump to the results. You see here the global inflation dynamics. If you look at the vertical scale, I should be clear if you say that looks very low. That's just ranging from -1% to +1%. In this study, as indicated here in the graph, inflation is not at the analyzed rate that we had seen in our previous figures that we had looked at, but is on a month-to-month basis, right? And so just as one illustration, if we had month-to-month an inflation rate of 1%, that on an annual basis would be more than 12%, right? 12 times 1 plus the additional cumulative effect. So more than 12% range of inflation. And so from that perspective, this makes good sense, right? That the most recent rate of inflation here is maybe at about 0.6, 0.65. If we analyze that, you get back to the numbers that we had seen in the previous graphs and figures and tables. So you see in this graph from January 2020 to the beginning of 2022, the average, again, month to month rate of inflation in the global economy as measured through those 85 advanced and emerging market economies. That's the curve that I'm following here backwards. And then you see for each month a decomposition into the oil price. Again, that's quite easy to measure because we included in that model beyond the rates of inflation, beyond output growth, the oil prices directly. So the dark blue portion of the vertical bar for each month is the oil price contribution. And then in orange and red, however, we have those unobservables. What portion is due to supply shocks, right? We had mentioned before, this may be the supply bottlenecks, this may be lockdowns that are causing firms to shut down, therefore not produce. On the demand side, of course, it could also be partially, specifically in the context of the pandemic, lockdown restrictions, that people were locked down at home, couldn't engage in activities like going to the movies, going to a concert, going to a bar, just because it wasn't even allowed, right? And so just not having the chance to engage in that kind of consumption. Of course, it could be also driven by reductions in demand, because households had less income available, that some would have lost their job in the pandemic. The whole range of possible demand shocks as well, right? That's in the red color. And so what you see as we are going back here into early 2020, of course, the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? The world economy, that's of course not plotted here because the figures here are just inflation, but I'm sure you all know that the world economy in all countries entered recessions as the COVID-19 pandemic started. And you can see here nicely the impact on prices, and therefore the rate of inflation was specifically through the reduction in demand. Now, inflation starts to pick up again, become positive again in about mid-2020. And so for us, of course, now in terms of thinking about the recent rise in global inflation, that's the most interesting part. And you see that if we look at, this period from mid-2020 to early 2021, as also stated here at the bottom, this initial rebound of economic activity. The economy is moving out of the recession in terms of moving from terrains of negative output growth into positive output growth, was initially mainly driven by rebounding oil prices. That oil prices started to rebound from about May 2020. But then when you see this acceleration of inflation from about July 2021 onwards, that it's not just primarily about these rebounding oil prices anymore, but that now we are also starting to look at contributions specifically here, right, of these supply and demand shocks. Why is that important? That is important because if all of these changes in the rate of inflation were due to oil prices, there's relatively little that policymakers in oil importing countries could really do about fighting off inflation, right? Because they are not the ones who can really set the price of oil. The price of oil is set by the oil exporters. Of course, we could, from the perspective of oil importing countries, say, well, let's reduce our imports for oil. Let's go for alternative forms of energy. Germany in particular has lots of discussion on that. I can assure you that all the debate here about going to alternative sources of energy, solar panels, energy created through windmills, all that's right now very, very high on the agenda of policymakers. But of course, that takes a lot of time, right? That takes a lot of time before you reach a point where you could really effectively substitute to a large degree out of importing oils into using alternative sources of energy. And so if inflation was mostly driven by oil prices, then there's relatively little one can do in terms of affecting that price growth quite directly, right? But if, as we see now for the most recent past, for the last 6 months of 2021, there's also these sizable contributions of the demand and the supply side. And it's not just about the oil prices and not just about the hope that at some point the oil price growth will fall back down again, that way inflation rates will fall again. But it's really about intrinsic factors within each and every economy. And then we specifically also talk, for example, about issues such as inflation arising domestically through wage pressures. Wage pressures, households negotiating for higher wages, reflecting that they have higher inflation expectations. And that's where macroeconomics really comes in particularly strongly, because once you are worried about inflation also rising because of dynamics that firms, households start to revise upward their expectations about inflation, then you're really worried that the inflation process is going to take off in the context of so-called wage price spirals. Now, what would be bad about that? What would be bad if that upward trend in inflation didn't come back down? Why is it costly for macroeconomies if inflation is not low and stable? What would low and stable mean? Probably depending on the specific country under consideration. For an advanced economy, this may probably typically be an inflation rate of about 2%, 2% growth in prices per year at a rather steady rate. Well, if that is not the case, that inflation in the macroeconomy is low and stable, that isn't, but if inflation is high, the biggest problem from the perspective of real economic activity, but also financial markets, is that then resources are not allocated efficiently. Why is that? Well, if aggregate inflation is rather high, then we also know empirically that's periods where the volatility of individual prices tends to be relatively high. As we have a lot of adjustment of individual prices. Now, if there's a lot of adjustment of individual prices, it becomes very difficult to really identify what are those industries where prices are falling in relative terms. And why is that important for us to be able to identify industries where prices are falling in relative terms? Because those are the industries that have relatively high productivity growth, that is, can produce more with given input, therefore can lower their prices. Those industries are important to identify because they are the industries that involve high productivity growth. Right? And if we think about the allocation of resources in financial markets, of course, all that financial market participants want to do is to identify what are those industries that have higher productivity growth, that will earn higher revenue, that are going to be more profitable. If we can't identify these, we're going to have a less efficient allocation of resources, and we're going to see overall lower output growth in the economy. So that's one first big cost of inflation not being low and stable. A second factor that's often thought about is, of course, if we have inflation, going back to something that I mentioned quite a bit earlier, so we have a devaluation of the purchasing power of households and firms. And that means that, of course, they're going to try to compensate for that and try to compensate for that even more when they think this is not just a very short-term development, but this is going to last. Those higher rates of inflation, they want to be compensated for it. They'll demand higher wages. The firms see those higher wages, observe higher production costs, and this sets off wage price spirals that may even be causing inflation to be at least temporarily unstable. And so for these, and I could cite more reasons, but I'll just leave it at those two reasons, there's broad consensus among macroeconomists that when inflation is high, we have empirically rather stagnating levels of economic activity. That is, output stagnates, and so from that perspective, our standard of living doesn't improve. Rather, when we see that inflation is stable and low, that's the right kind of environment within which we can observe economic growth and therefore an improvement in the standard of living of the people in the economy. How can policymakers then contribute to inflation being low and stable? Well, we in macroeconomics think of this as primarily being an issue for monetary policy. I'll just broadly outline the intuition for that. What can monetary policy do in this context of trying to control inflation? Well, what central banks, as part of their work, do is they are making liquidity, they're making funds available to the financial sector of the economy, specifically also the commercial banks, who in turn provide loans to households and firms. If a central bank, for example, was worried that inflation is rising, overshoots its target that it had set, what can it do? It can make the loans for the commercial banks who borrow liquidity from the central bank more costly. That is, charge a higher interest rate on those loans. When commercial banks see that it's becoming more costly for them to fund themselves, well, what they'll do, they'll try to pass on this higher cost to their customers, that is the households and firms that are borrowing from them. If the households, firms see that the cost of borrowing has gone up, what's going to happen? Well, the firms will see higher interest rate on those loans. Projects that previously were profitable under higher interest rates for loans may not be profitable anymore. So the firms will not carry out those projects, and that there's going to be less economic activity. Right? And for households, similar issues, it becomes too costly to take out loans, that they cannot fund some of their consumption anymore, and they'll reduce their consumption demand, leading to a lowering of the level of economic activity. Why would that be, however, exactly what the central bank is looking for in such a situation? Because if we then have less demand for consumption by the households, for investment in fiscal capital by the firms, what it does mean, there's going to be overall less demand for output produced. There's going to be possibilities to cut the costs of production, right? For example, also the wage bargaining position of the employees will weaken as output falls and unemployment rises. They're more worried now about keeping their job than about maintaining their purchasing power. We'll see lower wages, production costs for firms can lower prices, and the central bank gets exactly what it would like in the situation where we started out from, that initially were above the target rate of inflation, right? The rate of inflation falls. And so that's the broad intuition why central banks can, to some degree at least, control the rate of inflation. Now, from such intuition, it's still a far step, right, to go towards giving advice to policymakers and specifically informing them. If it did take such a step, such as making it more costly for the commercial banks in the economy to borrow from you, to what extent is this going to bring inflation back down, and how costly is that in the short run in terms of suffering losses of output before we eventually hopefully revert back to that low and stable inflation environment that's most conducive to output growth. And so the second example that I'll show you here from work is actually work of Dr. Ha and myself together with PhD students, where we are, and this is still work in progress, have begun to set up a structural macroeconomic model for Vietnam, take into account specific institutional aspects of the Vietnamese economy, and looking at Vietnam as it interacts, in particular with the US economy and the rest of the world. And then within such a structural model, us being able to do counterfactual analysis. What would happen if, for example, the State Bank of Vietnam adapted its monetary policy, observing a rise in inflation, and rise in inflation in particular, that's also global, and so that not just the State Bank of Vietnam may react to it, but that monetary authorities around the world would react to it. Just like before with this factor model, of course, this is not the point in time to go to the specifics of such a model. That may well take a good bit more than 60 minutes that I said it would take in the context of this factor model before, to explain all of that, just to give you a bit of a sense, right? What does modern macroeconomics do? Modern macroeconomics is very micro-founded and says, if we want to understand what's happening in a macroeconomy, we have to go back to the level of individual decision makers. Individual decision makers, such as the households in this notation here, deciding about their consumption, deciding about their hours worked, and therefore, of course, also indirectly the hours of leisure, by maximizing a utility function and not just maximizing current period utility, but that's what this term here indicates, looking into the future as well, though the future is discounted relative to the current period. Such households will have budget constraints. In our model, they have budget constraints where, of course, they earn, for example, through the hours worked, but they are also able to save in any given period, and so we invest in bonds and earn returns on those bonds. They're the owners of the firms, they get the profits from the firms. And so overall, just their spending has to equal to the revenue that they have available from work income, from financial investment income, possibly even entrepreneurial activity. The households in our model own the firm, so they are responsible also for thinking about how much are we going to set aside in any given period from the overall income earned to invest in physical capital that is funded through the savings of the households in the forms of bonds and other financial assets. And the last equation is just indicating that those households also bargain for wages, that for them, of course, it's going to be crucial also in terms of thinking about how many hours they work, what is the wage level that they will get when working. And so this last optimization problem here is one in the earnings that they will obtain for given hours work through setting the wages in W. Right? Just to give you a broad idea, again, I know this is far too brief to go into the specifics, but what we learn from this is now in credit level macroeconomics, as we'll do it in the MSc in Global Finance Economics, you think about what's happening in the macroeconomy by going back to the level of individual decision makers, here the households, and then aggregating back up. So then, of course, there's not just households in the economy, there's also firms that are producing, and without, again, going to specifics, some of the subscripts here, because the G subscripts indicate that we model the Vietnamese economy as being made up of particular two sectors, privately owned firms, state-owned firms that need to fund their production, either through internal net worth or through borrowing. And that then there's a problem in terms of borrowing, that the banks in the economy don't really know how good are those firms, how productive are those firms. And so for the banks, it's relatively risky to lend to the firms, not knowing how good the individual firms are. And the key difference here in this model is that the government is guaranteeing those loans for the state-owned firms, but not for the privately owned firms. And so the privately owned firms will have to pay a risk premium on their loans that they take out. And then in the end, across the privately and state-owned firms, the output is accumulated, and the firms also have an intertemporal optimization problem in terms of setting their prices. There's, of course, government institutions in such a model. I just have here, algebraic description of the decision-making of the monetary authorities, that here in this model as an institutional specificity for Vietnam, care in particular also about targeting exchange rate of the dong relative to the US dollar, not just per se caring about inflation, about output, but being very concerned also about the exchange rate between the dong and the US dollar, because in our model, like in reality, trade occurs in US dollars, not in local currency or the currency of the destination country in general, but in general is priced in US dollars. And so, of course, if the revenue for the exporters comes in US dollars, it's very crucial, right? What is that then worth in terms of dong? And so that's also an exchange rate stability target for the monetary authority. There's a reserve requirement that's also set endogenously. What I'm not even showing you here is equations for the US, equations for the rest of the world. But these economies interact with each other. They trade with each other. That we think of the world as being basically a global value chain, right? That you have certain components produced in one country, then being exported to another country, where those components may be assembled together for the final good to be produced. That we set up this world economy in such a way that it probably mimics realistic features of the global value chain. Could mention a number of other things that get me excited when talking about this model. But again, at this point, of course, it's not realistic for you to expect that you can follow what's in this model. So again, I just want to use this setup to show you some results as to what can you get with such a model. And so what we do then with this model, after we have set it up, solved it in its entirety, all these optimization problems of the households and the firms in Vietnam, in the US, in the rest of the world, studied the pricing, studied the wage setting. What do you do with it? We try to mimic a situation as we may see in the world now with the global rise in inflation, and specifically think about that contribution to that global rise in inflation that's coming from rising prices of energy, of commodities more largely. We think of that as a negative supply shock, right? That is just everything else equal. If firms have to pay a higher price for energy, if they have to pay a higher price for commodities that go into the production of output, everything else equal, for given cost of production, of course, they can only produce less, right? Because they could afford less energy, less commodities going into the production. So what's going to be the impact in terms of, say, output, in terms of, say, consumption, in terms of investment, in terms of trade balance on Vietnam? The other economies, I'm just showing here the US, not really the rest of the world. And so what you see is, you see that our model embeds the idea that central banks will react systematically, as we discussed before, that central banks are worried that if they don't respond to this rise of inflation, that inflation dynamics could take off, and that eventually we observe outcomes where output is continually stagnating in a high inflation environment. So in the US, the monetary authority reacts. There's two different colors here. One in orange is our model. The blue one is a comparison model from the literature. But in both models, you see that in the US, you see hiking of the monetary policy rate, making it more costly for the commercial banks to borrow. And we say here, well, let's presume the same happened in Vietnam. Right? Suppose you have the same type of reaction in Vietnam. What you do see is a sizable loss in output. A sizable loss in output, and actually our model predicts a quite bit of a stronger reaction than previous models. And we argue that's because previous models don't have the requisite institutional detail for the Vietnamese economy. So there's no question, right, that we say, well, if you have such a reaction of the monetary authorities, there can be a relatively sizable loss of output. If you just want to get an idea what these numbers here mean, I should comment on this briefly. These are deviations relative to the no-shock world, right? So this is not a prediction here that the output in Vietnam would now fall by, say, close to 1%. this is a prediction relative to what would happen otherwise, right? What would happen on top of all the other things that happened anyway. But it clearly says, yes, if you want to bring this inflation back under control, you're probably gonna suffer quite non-trivially in the short run. But then the benefit, right, as you see here, is when you look at inflation, you start to bring down the impact of this shock through the rising prices of energy commodities. You bring that down, you bring inflation back under control, hope that there's no inflation expectations dynamics developing where there's going to be these hikes in wages that cause wage price spirals and so on. And so then you enjoy again those benefits, right, from a more stable inflation environment where resources are allocated efficiently and therefore we observe again positive output growth, all those issues that we had before as to why it's nice to have a world of low and stable inflation. And so I'll leave it at that, at this graph here, to show you that when you're going to be in the MSc in Global Finance Economics, you're going to learn to set up models, macroeconomic models, but of course for other issues, models of financial markets, for asset pricing, for corporate finance, and through these models will come up with quantitative answers, and in particular be able to understand what's structurally happening and what is the impact of policy interventions, also changing decisions, right? If decision functions changed for firms, households, what's the impact on the economy at large, or if you're more interested on a specific market, what's the impact on that specific market, right? And that's important, that you don't generally have to wait for getting answers from some experts or so-called experts, but are able to carry out that analysis on your own. And that's what our program is for, to enable you to do that. And I take, I would conjecture, maybe I should say that way, I should conjecture that those of you who studied economics finance before will say, even though you only gave a rather brief snapshot into modeling approaches, say in this example of factor modeling, in the example of structural mechanics models, these are not models we saw at the bachelor level. So this is clearly going to be a step up, and the step up that's really going to help you in terms of realistically quantifying the models and therefore engaging in analyses as to what impact will shocks have, what impact will policy interventions have, what impact will changes in behavior by households, firms have on the variables of interest to you. So I'd leave it at that for this very first part, and if I understand the schedule correctly, I should at this point open the floor to possible questions that you may have, and I'm sure Dr. Ha will be happy to respond to, specifically when it gets into specifics of the Vietnamese economy that despite all of his introduction, I still don't know well enough to give strong answers on such questions.
Yes, thank you for your sharing. And I think that all the audience today got better understanding about the cost of inflation around the world and how policymakers reduce the inflation. And we believe that the audience will have a number of questions and concerns to Dr. Binder and Dr. Levenhard. So this is the time, very ideal time for discussion. And to all the audience and the student today, you can raise us the question by raising hand, giving the direct question to Professor Binder, or you can put the question in the chat box and we deliver it to respond today. Yes, so this is time for the question. So the first question, please. So dear Professor Binder and Dr. Lê Văn Hà. So I received the very first question. So this is a question that Vietnam is now considered one of the most dynamic emerging economies. However, our macroeconomic framework still features a relatively close financial account and a tightly controlled exchange rate. Could you please elaborate the implication of the setting to the abilities of our central bank to manage the rising wave of inflation we are facing today?
Maybe you want to go first on that one.
Yeah. So I would like to repeat the question. So could you please elaborate the implication of the setting of the central bank to the ability to manage the rising wave of inflation that Vietnam facing today? So it much easier for you that I can type the question in the chat box.
Do you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you well.
If you go first, yeah, and then maybe I can add something, but I think it's specifically targeted at the expertise. So maybe you can go first.
Yeah, so Dr. Ha, this is the question about Vietnam economy. So can you go first? And after that, Professor Binder, we have make a clarification.
Could you please type the question into the chat box, and I will go part by part.
Yeah, okay. So this is the first question. It's a little bit long.
So if I can restate the question from my side also. Okay, that's not there. Also about financial account issues. And,
you can find the question on a chat box.
Yeah. So thank you for the question. I think in this framework, let's say Professor Binder already presented in our study, we already can take into account the. Can you hear me, Mr. Thư?
Hear you very well.
Okay, good. Thank you. So we already took into account the consideration the fact that in Vietnam the exchange rate is still under managed of the central bank, and so with that, you know, from our macroeconomics models, we understand that when the central bank have to manage have to pay the attention to the exchange rate target, some of the limits will be there for them to when they have to also look at the interest rate. What is the right interest level for the economy? So in that way, the central bank might have less flexibility in their determination on, especially in the face of an adverse shock in the international commodity price, right? For example, if the price is higher, meaning that the input price for the economy is also higher. When the input price is higher, what is the best way to help the economy in this way? Can the central bank consider cutting the interest rate? But if it consider cutting the interest rate, that will threaten its ability to maintain the exchange rate target. So that would be some competing or maybe competing goals that may not be achieved simultaneously. But I also think that with the closed capital account, meaning that the closed financial accounts, the flows of capital can somehow also be managed. So Vietnam, to some extent, can mitigate the impact of having to fight two wars at the same time. Let's say, on the one hand, it has to try to mitigate the negative impacts of a surge in global price, especially the surge in global in the import prices, because so in that way it could the closed financial account might prevent the economy from having better interaction with the world economy in the normal time, but in such a setting it might also to some extent it help a little bit by mitigating the free flows of the capital, so it put less pressure on the changes in the exchange rate that might not be in the direction that the central bank wants to maintain. So Professor Winda, would you want to elaborate more on that one from the more international and theoretical point?
Let me just, maybe add a couple sentences coming from the model here in particular. I think I'll stick in my response to the model. So what you see in this model here, right, is again that we put into the model that the state bank would hike the monetary policy rate, and as an implication of that, because of the relative changes in monetary policy rates in Vietnam, the US, and the rest of the world, in our model, you do see that the dong would be predicted in our model to depreciate. And that leads exactly to the impact that Dr. Ha was describing, that per se, of course, that causes an increase in import prices. Nonetheless, in terms of the overall trade balance, in the parameterization that we have for this model, nonetheless, the dominant effect is on the export side, so that the trade balance does improve, and that helps to soften the impact that comes from the decreases in investment in consumption on the overall impact in output. Now, from that perspective, our model's argument would be that yes, you may want to be prepared to give up a bit of that exchange rate stability in order to be able to bring back inflation down faster than you would otherwise be able to do if you just wait, for those external shocks to recede or vanish altogether. But again, risk that in the meantime, you may also have internal inflation dynamics. But it's a trade-off, as Dr. Ha was describing. But if you took this model at face value, then it may be worth it to forego some exchange rate stability in order to bring inflation back under control and have that low, stable inflation environment as a conducive factor for output growth. On the issue of capital controls, well, we don't have, in this model, a rich set of interactions between Vietnamese financial markets and those in the rest of the world. We have in the model that there is a bond in the US that can also be purchased by financial investors in Vietnam. That's the one interaction in financial markets that we have. We'd have to do the work of basically saying, okay, well, if we switch that off, right, and in that way simulated a tightening of the control on financial capital flows, how would that affect the model results? That's what we could do. It may be yet more interesting in a framework where there's in principle a yet richer set of possibilities for financial capital flows between our Vietnamese economy and the rest of the world. That's something that we may well do in the future. But any model has to have its emphases, points of emphasis. And so at this point, that's not what we have specifically focused on in terms of modeling detail. Let me finally say, though, I've done other work on longer run issues in terms of benefits of financial equation for output growth. And I think that's mirroring what Dr. Haas said already, that in the longer run, you can expect that yes, an economy will benefit from integration into global financial markets, as long as that economy is able to use those funds that flow in, to use them in a conducive way. That is, have internally the right regulatory framework to ensure that the financial capital can flow to its most productive users, and also ensure that there's a governance framework that's conducive to issues of new business being set up, developing, that they have a reliable judicial framework within which to operate. This work is not specifically for Vietnam. This work is much more broadly in the context of advanced emerging market and developing economies. But in general, we do know that broader financial equation is conducive if the domestic policy framework accommodates that. But we also know that in the short run, and that's what Dr. Ha also said, there may be situations where you can dampen crisis impacts by putting restrictions of international financial capital flows, and that assessment is nowadays also shared by major organizations such as the IMF, that traditionally used to much more favor the liberalization of financial accounts, but nowadays is quite careful to emphasize that the conditions for that have to be right. So much from my side on that.
Okay, thank you, Professor Binda. So I think as the economy developed and as the financial sector in Vietnam developed, for sure that we will consider the government will look at the strategy to have more liberation of the financial account, because that in the end will benefit the economy. So we have another question from a student who asked on the very first slide, could you please explain why it is a case when rising inflation expectations set off a wage price spiral? So that's something, I think this is the slide.
Right, thanks for that question as well. And yes, I think I went back to that slide where I first talked about this issue. So the idea is relatively simple. The idea is that if households expect that inflation is rising, and not just in the very short run, but that there are lasting rises in the rate of inflation, then they do expect that their cost of living will keep rising, right? And that is a situation where it's of course very reasonable for them to ask to be compensated for that, because otherwise they will face a reduction in their standard of living. And so what we do know is that perhaps the most dangerous part of such external inflation shocks is when it leads to adjustments in wages. When there are sizable adjustments in wages that go above growth of productivity. Wage increases that are in line with the growth of productivity are per se neutral for the production cost of firms. But wage increases that go above the growth of productivity, they are one-to-one increases in the cost of production for firms. Now, when firms see their cost of production rising, everything else equal, of course, they will want to be compensated for that, right? And so they will compensate for having to pay higher wages through rising the prices of their products. What's going to be the implication of that? Well, if the firms raise the prices of their product, that means again that the cost of living for the households is rising. And so they will say again, well, but we have to be compensated for that, right? We need to demand higher wages in order to maintain our standard of living. And so in the next round, they will ask again for higher wages, which once more, if those wage increases then are going to be above the rate of productivity growth, to further rises in the cost of production for the firms. And that means yet again, right, that the cost of living for households has gone up, and they will demand to be compensated for that through rising wages. And that's what we call a wage price spiral, right? That on the one hand, there's always the households who will see these higher costs of living and want to be compensated for that through faster wage growth. And the firms, when seeing this faster wage growth, will say, well, we have to compensate for that in the pricing of our products, and therefore push through higher pricing. That means a higher rate of inflation. And that can accelerate, and we know specifically in the advanced economies from the 70s, early 80s, if you, for example, think to the US, even in the US, we had rates of inflation of well above 10%, monetary policy rates that were close to 20% in order to bring this process to an end. But when you bring the process to an end in such dramatic fashion, you face enormous losses in output, right? And so that's what central banks would want to avoid, that it gets that far, that process, because then it's going to be extremely costly. Then we are not talking anymore about hikes in the monetary policy rates of a quarter point, half a point, as we've seen it, for example, in terms of the most recent adjustments of the Federal Reserve in the US. Then we are talking about rate adjustments of 3%, 5% and the like, and that can cause dramatic losses in output. And so that's what we'd like to fend off rather early on, and make sure that these rises in the rate of inflation are not leading to this back and forth between increases in wages and firms' prices, and thus avoiding what we call a wage price spiral.
Yes, Dr. Han.
I think the answer from Professor Binder is already very clear. Yeah, so it's the wages and salaries consist major part of the production cost to the firms. So that is the origins of the spiral that could lead as a result to when the inflation rate is too high. So I do not know if there are still remaining questions, Mr. Thư.
Yes. So have any question left here? So I think that this is the time for. So I believe that Professor Dr. Binder have prepared some slides to the GFE candidate. I think that this is time for Professor Dr. Michael Binder can present a slide shortly to student and candidate in this seminar today.
Okay, so let's say in this second part, our discussion will be more specific to the GFE program. So as the public lecture today, the audience also includes the ones who want to focus on understanding the problems of rising inflation only, right? So let's say this part will be more GFE focused. So for the participants who want to, this is mainly will be important, and for those who want to apply for the GFE program now or in the future, right? So Professor Binder, Could you please go on with the instruction for our prospective students?
Sure. So I had prepared slides that provide some broader background on the MSc in Global Finance and Economics, but I understand from you, Dr. Ha, that those who are interested in further details about the program probably already are aware about institutional considerations, such that this is a joint effort by the Vietnamese-German University and the Faculty of Economics and Business at Goethe University, are aware of our broader goals that we wish to contribute to the development of financial markets, economic analysis in Southeast Asia through specifically helping with our program that Vietnam sees a new generation of graduates who are strongly quantitatively skilled and analytically proficient in finance as well as economics, and that we have therefore designed a program that features classes that introduce to the core methodology in finance on the economic side, including microeconomics, but overall having an emphasis on macroeconomics, and also introducing to the methodologies that help in terms of working with data, econometrics, data science. And that nonetheless, we are not going to be a program that's going to stay in some ivory tower, but rather are going to be a program that will want to use this methodology to address topical questions, just like we talked about it today in terms of rising inflation. And this is also going to be supported in the program through us not having lectures from the academic side only. I think they're going to be very good lectures, but nonetheless, we'll also have lectures from the practitioner side, and that we're going to bring in practitioners both from financial markets and from economic policy decision-making, so that program participants can see firsthand that not just we as academic talks about these methodologies being useful, but they're actually going to be used by the decision makers and staff at central banks, commercial banks, investment banks, and so forth. But I understand that the emphasis of what I should say now, to avoid this getting another hour-long talk, should be to talk a bit more about the application process. And that I understand there's also a good number of inquiries already. We are very happy to see that level of interest, and that in that context, there's been specifically questions arising about the sample essay that we are asking for as part of the application package. The other parts of the application package that we're asking for, I think, partially are relatively standard, such as the transcript degree certificate, maybe not so standard that we are asking for the GRE-GMAT score, but those of you who've already talked with Dr. Ha, I'm sure are well aware that we are willing to look very much at the individual case, and if there's a strong case for your prior studies involving a very significant mathematical, statistical component, that we're also willing to waive that requirement, but that the other way around, when we're not willing to waive it, that it should be in your own best interest to make sure that what we expect in terms of quantitative skills is something that you can bring into the program, that the program is going to be a joy for you, rather than a struggle, and a simulation supply to this TOEFL IELTS, the English language test score. But again, we just want to make sure that you feel happy participating in a program that's full in English language. Probably also a bit non-standard is this letter of evaluation. There, while we think it would be very nice and very good if you can contribute a letter from a former professor who knows you a bit better, if you were in a program where there was no such ability for any faculty member to get to know you better, we'd also be happy with a letter that came from the department head or a director of studies that indicated what percentile within your prior program you graduated in, that is how strong your GPA was. And so this shouldn't become a hurdle to the application. I also think that the essay shouldn't become a hurdle, but maybe it's a quite unknown element. And so that's what I wanted to talk today a bit more about in the second part. Just this one slide, so no worries that I'll come now with another 20 slides for you to understand what this essay should be about. I think it's relatively straightforward, the idea. So the idea is that in a first step, we want to see that you care about the kind of topics that will be covered in the global finance and economics program, right? So it's very important that there's no mismatch between expectations, what am I going to learn in this program, and what this program can actually offer. And so from that perspective, given that the focus in the program is on finance and within the economic side, mostly on macroeconomics, what we'd like to see is that you can write about the topic in one of these areas. Where could I possibly get an idea from? What I could write about, recommendations that I could readily give is, for example, if you look at The Economist, that's a weekly publication that primarily, as the name would suggest, discusses issues that have relevance in economics, but certainly also includes a good many articles that are more on political issues per se, on decision-making that may not be per se related to macroeconomics or to financial markets. But nonetheless, in every week, they have major issues being discussed that you could pick on. If you don't have access to The Economist, there's also, for example, a free website, voxeu.org, that picks on current issues that the policymakers do discuss, and where academics, on the basis of relatively recent research, provide insight into what recommendations their research would have for addressing topics of broader societal interest. Also at the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, there's a quite similar such site, again, freely accessible, blogs.imf.org. Those are just three examples. There's, of course, many more on the side of the news media in terms of the national press. You could also look at the Wall Street Journal as just one example. You can look at outlets of central banks, domestically, but also internationally, certainly central banks such as the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Canada, the European Central Bank, they all have every month research bulletins where currently important issues are looked at from the perspective of more formal financial economic modeling. So I trust, if you go through such sources over the past few months, possibly the past year or so, you'd have an abundance of topics, and it becomes then again actually more difficult to decide which topic rather than to think about, is there anything that I could write on? If you're now going through all of these outlets over the past few months or so, you say there's absolutely nothing that interests me, then I'm a little bit afraid that you will also say in the program, there's absolutely nothing that interests me. And that's what we want to avoid, right? What we want to avoid from both sides. If you say, okay, there's just nothing in finance and macroeconomics that I find exciting to think about, to look at, you're not going to become happy in our program, and I'm afraid we'll have to send you to other programs that study civil planning or philosophy or whatever it may be that's capturing your mind where you can be a lot happier than in our program, right? So that's the first part, and why we want to have that, and however realistically we can go about identifying a topic. Then once you have that topic, then we want you to say in your own words, why do you find this of interest to you personally, but also from the perspective of why you think it matters for all of us to give that thought. And so that would be your introduction of your essay, stating the topic and why you have chosen it. Right, and ideally, again, it would help us understand why you think that topic is particularly interesting, but on top of it also, and that I'm sure will be implied by what you have read, also why it is important more broadly for society at large. What would I do in the next step after you have chosen the topic, know what your motivation is? Well, we'll want you to look a bit into what's written in academia, what's written at policy institutions, what's written at the financial firms about the topic that you have chosen. How? Well, for example, through Google search, right? Just use the right keywords in Google, and I'm sure you'll find on any topic that's currently of significant concern and is covered in such outlets, you'll find papers. Needn't be papers that have all been written in the last few weeks or month. This could also be a topic, that's now coming up again, but was a topic in the past, right? For example, when we think about rising inflation, that was very much an issue in the late 70s, early 80s. And so you could also go back to a paper from those days and say, let me study what they did. Now, when I say let me study what they did, of course, we are not asking you to get into technical aspects of research papers, right? They will most likely be beyond what you can do at this point, not what you can do upon graduation, but what you can do at this point, technical aspects of papers, specifically more recent papers, will probably not something that you should spend lots of time on. That's also not what we want to see, right? Whether you could manage all on your own. If you really can manage all on your own, then again, maybe you don't really need our program. So that's not the expectation, right? That you can manage it all on your own and tell us that you understand each and every paper that's out there in academic journals. That's not at all our expectation, but you should be able to read non-technical parts such as the introduction, the abstract, the conclusion, the section discussing empirical findings. That's something that you should be able to generally read. And so we'd like you to tell us what you think is the current assessment about the question that you have chosen. This is not about completeness, right? We are not expecting you here to read 20, 50, 100 papers, summarize them, or the like. This is just more for us to see, can you relate to a work that's a bit more formal and summarize some major findings that are out there in the literature on the topic of interest to you. And then on the basis of that, we'd like you to reflect upon issues that you think should be addressed, but weren't addressed. Again, it's not the issue that if there is some work that you weren't aware of, that addresses exactly the issues that you thought are still worth addressing, that then this essay would be a complete failure. Now that, of course, you should be honest, right? It's a key thing in academic work to be honest. So don't say, okay, here's another paper and I'm just copying their questions and claim I haven't read that paper. That's probably something that we'll figure out anyway. So don't do that. But again, it's not about completeness that you have to search all of the literature. We just want to see that you develop thoughts on your own that can go beyond pure replication. That's also going to be important in the program, because eventually, right, we want you to be able to carry out your own analysis, to identify your own questions. It's going to be a major issue, for example, in the context of individual papers for courses, seminars, that you show with that zest to say, I don't just want to answer specific questions that other people give to me in the context of courses, in the context of examinations. No, I want to also think about, well, what's still missing. That's what we want to see there. Ideally, you would also indicate to us how you would go about addressing these questions. Of course, not in a formal way, right? That you now have to study econometric literature to see what econometric models are out there to do this, but describe it in a verbal form, how you think one could go about it. And again, they are not about us seeing something specific that we'd like to see in terms of modeling. Just what we want to see is that you give these issues thought and can describe them. That's what we are looking at here in this context. So overall, these essays are not, like a bachelor thesis or any other thesis, where we look, is this comprehensive enough? This is not about issues like an examination where we just judge right or wrong. It's not about, whether you give the policy advice that we personally may prefer. It's not all of that. We just want to see that you're interested in the substance, and then relative to what we can expect from you, right? Of course, we know from your CV what you have studied before, possibly beyond studies, what professional experience you have, that relative to your prior experience, you do a good job. And so, of course, if you come from computer science, right, we expect per se less than from someone who has graduated from a bachelor program in finance and spent 5 years in the financial marketplace already. But I think that's only right. Whenever it's about admissions to programs, it also should be relative to experience opportunities that were out there already. But what I'm not trying to say with that is to scare those of you who've already had a good bit of exposure to economics, possibly also professional exposure to economics or finance. No, I'm just trying to encourage those of you who haven't had such a strong exposure. Right? Don't be afraid of that. We understand what we have done in the past, and so of course we always put that in perspective, what we see in the essay. The last part here is please pay attention to the 2,000 words restriction. Now, I don't think we are planning to put a counting machine on all of that, and that will discard your application as soon as we found that the essay contained 2,002 words. We won't do that. But what we certainly would not appreciate if someone said, okay, I'm just putting instead my bachelor thesis into the application dossier. That's not what you're looking for here. It's far too much to possibly read, and it doesn't do exactly what we are looking for here, right? So please do something that's tailored to what we are looking for, and for everyone involved. This shouldn't become something where you submit in the end 5, 10 pages or the like. 2,000 words, I would say that's 2 pages in reasonable font, and that's what it should be. So from that perspective, hopefully that also indicates that we are not expecting that you will spend a completely extraordinary amount of time on writing this essay. I hope this helps, but of course, if there's more questions on that, I'll and I'm sure Dr. Haswell will be happy to address these.
Well, okay, thank you, Professor Binda. I think the MSI is sending more questions from the audience regarding the first part of the lecture, but let's say we can answer them via email later. So let's say we already moved to the second part. But thank you very much for this explanation. I think from we already received
Hello, Dr. Ha.
We have this section here. We have further questions. Okay, can you hear me? Hello.
Very clear. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So if you still have further questions, please don't hesitate to contact us, Professor Binder and myself, and the MSR. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Levang Ha, and thank you for all the questions from audience and student. We have plenty of the question, so please send us on your question. After that, we can respond you via email or message. Thank you for attending the seminar. I would like to express our sincere thanks to special guests today, Professor Dr. Michael Binder and Dr. Levang Ha, and to all the audience and students. And you do have 2 more events on June 4 with the topic corruption measurement, and on July 9 with the topic corporate debt at risk policy response. And thank you for watching our seminar today, and wish you have a good night. Yeah, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much from my side as well to everyone involved.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.